They told me there wasn't enough room at the Easter table. 24 seats around that massive dining room, and somehow there wasn't space for one more. But what they didn't know was that I was holding on to something that would change everything. By the time they realized what they'd done, it was too late. The fortune they thought belonged to them was never theirs to begin with, and I was about to make sure they understood exactly what no room really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Johnson, but everyone calls me Doc. I'm 57 years old, and this Easter Sunday was supposed to be like any other family gathering at my sister Patricia's sprawling colonial house in Westfield Heights, the same house where we'd celebrated every major holiday for the past 15 years. Ever since Patricia married into money and decided she was the family matriarch. But this Easter was different. This Easter they made it clear that I was no longer welcome in their perfect little world. I pulled into the circular driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, just like I had every year since Patricia moved into this house. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, creating a canopy of pink petals that danced in the spring breeze. Easter lilies lined the walkway, their white trumpets announcing the resurrection with silent reverence. It was picture perfect, like something from a magazine spread about elegant entertaining. Patricia had always been good at creating beautiful facades. I carried my contribution to the feast, my grandmother's famous honey-glazed ham, the recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of Johnson women, the same recipe that Patricia had tried to get from me countless times, but I'd never written it down. Some things I believed should be earned through love and respect, not demanded through entitled expectation. The front door was already open, with Patricia's husband Richard greeting guests like he was running for mayor. He was a tall man with silver hair that always looked perfectly styled, even on weekends. His smile was practiced, the kind politicians wore when they needed votes. When he saw me approaching, that smile flickered for just a moment before snapping back into place. He said, not moving to help with the heavy dish I was carrying. Patricia's inside. She'll want to talk to you. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. It wasn't warm, it wasn't welcoming, it was the voice of someone delivering a message they'd rather not give. I nodded and stepped into the foyer, immediately hit by the scent of fresh flowers and Patricia's expensive perfume that always reminded me of department store cosmetic counters. The house was buzzing with activity. Patricia's twin daughters Madison and Morgan were setting up an elaborate Easter egg hunt in the backyard. They were 23 now, fresh out of college with degrees they'd never need, thanks to Richard's family money. They barely glanced up when I walked in, too absorbed in arranging pastel-colored eggs around the perfectly manicured garden. Patricia emerged from the kitchen wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked elegant as always, but there was something tight around her eyes, something that made her look older than her 54 years. Just that cold, business-like tone she'd adopted ever since she married Richard and decided she was too good for the rest of us. She led me into Richard's study, a room lined with leather-bound books that I was pretty sure he'd never read and awards from his real estate development company. Patricia closed the door behind us and turned to face me, her arms crossed like she was preparing for battle. There's been a change of plans, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. We're keeping today's gathering small, just immediate family. I stared at her for a moment, not understanding. I am immediate family, Patricia. I'm your sister. She shifted uncomfortably, finally looking at me directly. You know what I mean, married family. People with children. The celebration is really about the kids. And since you don't she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. The words hit me like a physical blow. Since I don't have what? A husband? Children? A trust fund? I'd been coming to these gatherings for 15 years, through Patricia's wedding, through the births of her daughters, through every milestone and celebration. I'd helped her set up this very house when they first moved in, spending my weekends painting walls and assembling furniture because that's what family does for each other. Patricia, what's really going on here? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She looked toward the window where we could see her husband's family gathering on the back terrace. His mother, Eleanor, was holding court in a wicker chair like some kind of Easter queen, surrounded by Richard's siblings and their perfect children. All of them dressed in pastels and pearls, all of them wealthy and connected and everything Patricia had always wanted to be. Eleanor thinks the table is getting too crowded, Patricia said finally, and she's not wrong. We've got 24 people already, and the dining room can only comfortably seat 24, I interrupted. You just said 24 people. That dining room has held 30 people before. I've seen it. Patricia's face flushed slightly. That was different. That was before. She stopped herself, but I could fill in the blanks. Before Eleanor decided I wasn't worth including. Before Patricia realized that having a sister who worked as a medical secretary didn't fit with the image she was trying to cultivate. Before what, Patricia? Before you decided you were ashamed of me. It's not about shame, she said quickly, but her voice wavered. It's about fit. Eleanor's family is very traditional. Very formal. They have certain expectations about what? About people who work for a living. About people who don't have trust funds and country club memberships. Patricia's silence was answer enough. I stood there in that expensive study, surrounded by leather and mahogany and the scent of money, and felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, more calculated. It was the feeling of finally seeing someone clearly for the first time. So this is it, I said. 15 years of family gatherings and now there's suddenly no room. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. Maybe next year. Next year. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Next year, when Eleanor decides whether I'm acceptable enough for her dining room. Patricia looked genuinely pained. And for a moment, I thought she might change her mind. I thought she might remember that we used to share a bedroom as children. That I was the one who held her hair when she was sick with morning sickness. That I was the first person she called when she got engaged. But then Richard's voice drifted in from the hallway calling for her. And the moment passed. I'm sorry, she said. But she was already moving toward the door. I really am. I followed her out of the study. Still carrying my grandmother's ham. Like some kind of consolation prize. The house felt different now. Like I was seeing it through new eyes. The expensive artwork on the walls. The fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. The Persian rugs that cost more than my car. All of it felt like a performance. A carefully constructed illusion of happiness and success. Patricia disappeared into the kitchen without another word, leaving me standing in the foyer like an unwelcome salesperson. Through the French doors leading to the backyard, I could see the Easter celebration in full swing. Children running around in their Sunday best, adults sipping champagne, and laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. It looked warm and inviting from the outside, like the kind of family gathering I'd always imagined having. But I wasn't imagining anymore. I was seeing the truth. I was seeing that no matter how many holidays I showed up for, no matter how many times I helped Patricia through her crises, no matter how much history we shared, I would always be disposable. I would always be the one who didn't quite fit, who could be uninvited when it was convenient. I walked back to my car slowly, the ham dish feeling heavier with each step. The cherry blossoms were still falling, coating my windshield with pink petals like nature's confetti, but there was no celebration in my heart. There was only the cold, hard realization that I'd been naive for far too long. As I drove away from Patricia's perfect house in her perfect neighborhood, I thought about something I'd been carrying with me for months, something I'd planned to share with the family today, something that would have changed everything. But now, sitting in my car with my grandmother's ham cooling in the passenger seat, I decided that some secrets were worth keeping. In my purse, tucked inside my wallet behind my driver's license, was a letter from the law firm of Preston Williams and Associates, a letter that informed me that my great-aunt Minerva had passed away 6 months ago and left me something significant in her will. Minerva had been the family eccentric, the one who never married and traveled the world collecting art and real estate. We'd exchanged Christmas cards over the years, but I'd never expected to inherit anything from her. The letter had arrived 3 months ago during a particularly difficult period when I was struggling to pay my rent and wondering if I'd ever be able to retire. I'd driven to the law office in downtown Springfield on a gray February morning, expecting to receive maybe a piece of jewelry or a small keepsake. What I found instead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Changed everything. Minerva had left me her entire estate. Not just money though, there was plenty of. She'd left me her art collection, worth nearly $2 million. She'd left me 3 rental properties in prime locations that generated substantial monthly income. She'd left me her sprawling Victorian house in the historic district, fully restored and worth more than Patricia's house and Richard's combined. But most importantly, she'd left me a handwritten letter explaining why. Dorothy, she'd written in her spidery handwriting, "You're the only one in this family who never asked me for anything. You're the only one who sent me birthday cards without expecting anything in return. You're the only one who called to check on me when I was sick. Not because you wanted something from my will, but because you cared. In a family full of people who mistake wealth for worth, you remained genuine. Everything I have is yours now. Use it wisely. And remember that true family isn't about blood. It's about love and loyalty. And showing up when it matters." I'd kept the inheritance quiet, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to tell the family properly. I'd imagined sharing the news at Easter dinner, maybe even offering to help Patricia and Richard with their mounting debt problems. Richard's real estate company had been struggling lately, and I knew they'd been borrowing against the house to maintain their lifestyle. I'd thought about generously offering to help, about being the kind of sister who showed up when family needed support. But sitting in my car outside Patricia's house, uninvited and unwanted, I realized how foolish that impulse had been. They didn't want my help. They didn't even want my presence. They wanted me to disappear, to pretend I didn't exist so they could play their games with Eleanor's family, without the embarrassment of acknowledging their middle-class root. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Margaret Preston, the lawyer handling Minerva's estate. It was Easter Sunday, but she'd given me her personal cell number and told me to call any time. I'd been putting off some of the final paperwork, partly because the whole situation still felt surreal, and partly because I'd been hoping to include my family in the celebration of this unexpected windfall. Now I had different plans entirely. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional even on a holiday. "How are you? I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." "I'm ready to move forward with everything," I said, watching through my rearview mirror as Patricia's guests continued their perfect Easter celebration. The property transfers, the art authentication, all of it. "I want it handled as quickly as possible." "Wonderful," Margaret said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I can have everything finalized by the end of the week. Are you sure you don't want to take more time to think about it? It's a significant change, going from your current situation to managing this kind of wealth." I thought about Patricia's face when she told me there wasn't room at the table. I thought about Richard's practiced smile and Eleanor's dismissive glances. I thought about 15 years of being treated like an obligation, instead of a sister. "I'm sure," I said. "And Margaret Curado, I want you to draw up a new will for me as well. Very specific instructions about who inherits what, and more importantly, who doesn't." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Of course, would you like to schedule an appointment for this week to discuss the details?" "Yes," I said, starting my car and pulling away from the curb. "And Margaret, I want to make some purchases as well, investment properties. I think it's time I diversified my portfolio." After I hung up, I drove toward downtown Springfield instead of heading home to my small apartment. I needed to see Minerva's house, my house, with new eyes. I needed to start thinking like the woman I was about to become instead of the woman I'd been. The Victorian mansion sat on 3 acres in the most exclusive part of the historic district, surrounded by mature oak trees and meticulously maintained gardens. I'd visited once, 3 months ago when Margaret first showed me the property, but I'd been too overwhelmed then to really appreciate what I was seeing. Now pulling into the circular driveway that made Patricia's look modest by comparison, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Power. Not the cruel, dismissive power that Eleanor wielded over her social circle, or the shallow materialistic power that Patricia craved. This was different. This was the power of choice, of independence, of never having to ask anyone for anything ever again. This was the power to decide who deserved space at my table and who didn't. I used the key Margaret had given me and stepped into the foyer of my new life. The house was magnificent. 12 rooms of period details and modern conveniences, filled with artwork and antiques that represented a lifetime of careful collecting. Minerva had exquisite taste, and more importantly, she'd maintained everything perfectly. This wasn't just a house, it was a statement. I walked through the rooms slowly, imagining how I would make this space my own. The formal dining room could easily seat 30 people, with its massive mahogany table and matching sideboard. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with professional-grade appliances and enough space to cater a wedding. The library was lined floor to ceiling with first editions and rare books, many of them signed by authors whose names I recognized from college literature classes. But it was the morning room that spoke to me most. It faced east, with tall windows that would fill the space with golden light every sunrise. Minerva had used it as her office, and her desk was still positioned to take advantage of the view of the rose garden. I could imagine myself here, drinking coffee and managing my new responsibilities, planning how to use this unexpected gift wisely. As I stood in that beautiful room surrounded by evidence of Minerva's thoughtful life and generous spirit, I made a decision that would change everything for my family. They'd chosen to exclude me from their celebration. They'd decided there wasn't room for me in their lives, unless I met their arbitrary standards of acceptability. Well, now I had standards too. And when they inevitably came calling, and they would, once they discovered what I'd inherited, I would be the one deciding whether there was room for them in mine. I pulled out my phone and called my real estate agent, a sharp woman named Carmen Rodriguez who'd helped me find my current apartment 2 years ago. She answered on the third ring, sounding slightly surprised to hear from me on a holiday. Everything okay? Carmen, I need you to do something for me, I said, walking over to the windows to look out at the rose garden. I need you to find out everything you can about a property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive in Westfield Heights. Market value, mortgage information, recent comparable sales, everything. Carmen was quiet for a moment. That's a pretty specific request for Easter Sunday. Is this about a potential purchase? Something like that, I said. And Carmen, I need this information quickly. By tomorrow morning if possible. You've got it. Anything else? I thought about Patricia's perfectly arranged Easter celebration, about Eleanor's dismissive attitude, about Richard's practiced smile that never reached his eyes. I thought about 15 years of being grateful for scraps, when I should have been demanding better. Yes, I said, I want you to start looking for rental properties in the Westfield Heights area, specifically, properties that might come available due to financial distress, people who've been living beyond their means and might need to sell quickly. Carmen's voice perked up with interest. Sounds like you've come into some money. Good for you. Yes, I said, looking around Minerva's my beautiful house. I have, and I'm planning to use it very strategically. After I hung up with Carmen, I spent another hour walking through the house, making mental notes about what needed updating, and what I wanted to keep exactly as Minerva had left it. The art collection alone was breathtaking. Original paintings by artists I'd only seen in museums, sculptures that belonged in galleries, jewelry that looked like it should be displayed behind velvet ropes. But it was the personal touches that moved me most. Photos of Minerva's travels, letters from friends around the world, books with handwritten notes in the margins. This wasn't just wealth. It was a life well lived. It was evidence of someone who'd chosen quality over quantity, experiences over possessions, authenticity over appearances. I found myself in what had been Minerva's bedroom, a spacious room, decorated in soft blues and whites with windows overlooking the back garden. On her nightstand was a framed photo I hadn't noticed during my first visit. It was a picture of the two of us from my college graduation, taken 15 years ago. I remembered the day clearly. Patricia and my parents had been too busy to attend the ceremony, but Minerva had driven 3 hours to be there. She'd taken me to dinner afterward, and told me how proud she was of me for putting myself through school while working full-time. You have more grit than the rest of them combined, she'd said over dessert. Don't let them convince you that struggling makes you less worthy, it makes you stronger. I'd thought about those words many times over the years, especially during the difficult periods when I'd felt like I was barely keeping my head above water financially. But I'd never imagined that Minerva had been planning something like this, that she'd been watching and evaluating, and ultimately deciding that I was the one who deserved her life's work. I picked up the photo and studied Minerva's face. She'd been in her 70s then, but her eyes were bright with intelligence and humor. She looked like someone who understood the value of patience, of watching and waiting for the right moment to act. Well, now it was my turn to watch and wait, and when the right moment came, when Patricia and Richard inevitably found themselves in serious financial trouble, when Eleanor's family fortune proved insufficient to bail them out, when they finally realized they needed someone who genuinely cared about them, I would be ready. But first, I had some preparations to make. I locked up the house and drove to my apartment, a modest one-bedroom place that had served me well but now felt impossibly small. After spending the afternoon in Minerva's mansion, I had some phone calls to make, some research to do, and some very important decisions to finalize about my new will. The first call I made was to my bank, where I'd been a customer for over 20 years. I spoke to the manager, a kind woman named Susan, who'd helped me through several financial rough patches over the years, and arranged to transfer my accounts to a private wealth management firm that Margaret had recommended. Susan was genuinely happy for my change in circumstances, which reminded me how differently people treated you when they had nothing to gain from the relationship. The second call was to my landlord, giving him notice that I'd be moving out at the end of the month. He seemed surprised. I'd been a reliable tenant who always paid on time, but he wished me well and promised to return my security deposit promptly. The third call was the most important one. I dialed Patricia's number, knowing she'd still be busy with her Easter celebration, but wanting to leave a message that would set the tone for everything that came next. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Patricia's voice sounded bright and cheerful as she apologized for missing the call and promised to get back to me soon. I waited for the beep, then spoke clearly and calmly. Patricia, it's Dot. I wanted to thank you for clarifying where I stand in this family. It was
Lightning.
I hope you and Eleanor's family enjoyed your Easter celebration. I certainly enjoyed mine. I spent the afternoon at my new house, making some important decisions about my future, decisions that I think you'll find very interesting when the time comes. But don't worry, I won't be bothering you with any more uninvited visits. I've learned my lesson about knowing my place. Sleep well. I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. I didn't want to deal with whatever response that message might generate. Not tonight. Tonight was for planning, for thinking strategically about how to handle the new reality I found myself in. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything I knew about Patricia and Richard's financial situation. Richard's real estate company had been struggling since the market downturn 2 years ago. They'd refinanced their house twice, and I knew from overheard conversations that they were having trouble making the payments on Patricia's car lease. Eleanor's family had money, but they were notoriously tight with it, preferring to maintain their wealth rather than share it. Patricia had always been proud, too proud to ask for help even when she needed it. She'd built her entire identity around being successful, around having made it to the upper class through her marriage to Richard. The idea of admitting financial distress would be devastating to her carefully constructed image, but financial distress was coming whether she admitted it or not. And when it arrived, I would be in a very interesting position to help or not help depending on how they chose to treat me going forward. I spent the rest of the evening researching property values in Westfield Heights and learning about the private wealth management firm that would be handling my new portfolio. It was fascinating, entering a world I'd never had access to before, discovering how differently money worked when you had enough of it to make it work for you. By the time I went to bed, I had a clear plan forming in my mind. I would move into Minerva's house quietly, without making any announcements to the family. I would begin investing strategically in real estate, particularly in properties that gave me leverage in Patricia's social circle. And I would wait patiently for the right moment to reveal my changed circumstances. The timing would be crucial. Too early, and they might try to manipulate me into bailing them out of their problems. Too late, and they might have already lost everything I could potentially help them save. I needed to wait until they were desperate enough to genuinely appreciate help, but not so desperate that help would be meaningless. As I drifted off to sleep in my modest apartment for one of the last times, I thought about the lesson Minerva had tried to teach me through her generous gift. Wealth wasn't just about money, it was about choices, about having the power to determine your own worth instead of letting others define it for you. For 57 years, I'd let other people decide whether I was valuable enough to include, successful enough to respect, worthy enough to love. I'd spent decades being grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection my family was willing to throw my way. But those days were over. Starting tomorrow, I would be the one making decisions about who deserved a place in my life and who didn't. And when Patricia and Richard and Eleanor's perfect family discovered what they'd lost by choosing to exclude me, it would be too late to undo the damage they'd done. I'd learned my lesson about knowing my place. My place was wherever I decided it should be. And right now, I was deciding that it was very far away from people who thought there wasn't room for me at their table. Soon enough, they would discover that there wasn't room for them at mine either. The next morning came with the kind of crisp clarity that only follows a night of profound decision-making. I woke up in my small apartment feeling different, like I'd shed an old skin while sleeping. The woman who had driven to Patricia's house yesterday, carrying a ham and hoping for acceptance, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that acceptance was something you gave yourself, not something you begged for from others. My phone had 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from Patricia. I scrolled through them while drinking my coffee, watching her tone evolve from confused, concerned, to slightly panicked. The first few messages were variations of "call me back," but by the time I reached the bottom of the list, she was writing things like, "I don't understand what you meant, and we need to talk about what happened yesterday." I deleted them all without responding. There would be time for conversations later, when I was ready to have them on my terms. Margaret Preston called at exactly 9 o'clock, her voice bright with professional efficiency. "I have excellent news. I was able to expedite all the paperwork over the weekend. Your inheritance is officially transferred, and I have the documentation ready for pickup. Are you available to come in this morning?" I was dressed and in my car within 20 minutes. The law offices of Preston, Williams & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of Springfield's most prestigious downtown building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun like a beacon. I'd been intimidated by the building the first time I visited, but now I walked through the marble lobby with confidence, like I belonged in spaces designed for people with serious money. Margaret met me in the reception area. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of understated elegance that comes from old money and Ivy League education. She led me to her corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. On her desk were neat stacks of legal documents, each one representing a different aspect of my new life. "Minerva was very thorough," Margaret said, settling into her chair across from me. "She updated her will 6 times in the last 2 years, each time becoming more specific about her intention. The final version, completed just 3 months before her death, makes it very clear that she chose you deliberately, and with full understanding of what she was doing." She handed me a leather portfolio containing all the documentation, property deeds, investment account statements, insurance policies, and a complete inventory of the art collection with current market valuations. The numbers were staggering. Even after taxes and legal fees, my net worth had increased by nearly $4 million overnight. "There's something else," Margaret said, reaching into her desk drawer. "Minerva left specific instructions about this." She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Minerva's familiar handwriting. "She wanted you to have this after all the legal matters were settled." I opened the envelope carefully, my hands steadier than they'd been yesterday. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, along with a small brass key. "My dear Dorothy," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've accepted the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders. I know it seems overwhelming, but I have complete faith in your ability to handle it wisely." The key enclosed opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 2. Inside you'll find something that will help you understand why I made the choices I did, and perhaps help you make some important choices of your own. Remember, true wealth isn't about accumulating money. It's about using resources to create the life you want, and to help the people who truly deserve it. You've always understood that distinction, even when others around you didn't. Use that wisdom now. With love and confidence in your future, Minerva. Margaret watched me read the letter, her expression patient, but curious. She was a remarkable woman, she said when I finished. In all my years practicing estate law, I've never seen someone plan their legacy with such careful consideration of character over blood relation. She really believed you were the right choice. She was right, I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. I am the right choice. Margaret smiled. I believe that too. Now, shall we discuss your new will? You mentioned yesterday that you wanted to make some specific provisions. We spent the next 2 hours crafting a document that reflected my new understanding of family and loyalty. I left generous bequests to the few people who had shown me genuine kindness over the years. My neighbor Mrs. Chin, who always checked on me when I was sick. My former supervisor at the medical office, who had mentored me through some difficult career transitions. Carmen, my real estate agent, who had always treated me with respect regardless of my budget limitation. But the most important part of the will was what it didn't include. Patricia, Richard, and their daughters were mentioned by name, but only to explicitly exclude them from any inheritance. The language was clear and legally ironclad, designed to prevent any future challenge. The message was equally clear: actions have consequences, and exclusion works both ways. Are you sure about this? Margaret asked as we finalized the wording. It's quite definitive. There's no provision for reconciliation or changed circumstances. I thought about Patricia's face yesterday, the way she'd looked past me instead of at me when she told me there wasn't room. I thought about 15 years of being treated like an obligation, of having my presence tolerated rather than welcomed. I'm sure. But I want to add one provision. If any member of my family contests this will or attempts to claim they were unfairly excluded, the entire estate goes to charity. They need to understand that some doors once closed don't reopen. After leaving Margaret's office, I drove straight to First National Bank. Box 24/7 was in the vault's most secure section, requiring 2 keys and a signature verification to access. The bank manager, a serious man with wire-rimmed glasses, escorted me personally to the vault area and left me alone with the box in a private viewing room. Inside were 3 items that made my breath catch. The first was a leather-bound journal, thick with entries dating back over 10 years. The second was a manila folder containing what appeared to be investigative reports and financial documents. The third was a collection of photographs that told a story I'd never known existed. I opened the journal first, recognizing Minerva's precise handwriting on the first page. It was dated exactly 10 years ago, just after Patricia's wedding to Richard. Dorothy called today to thank me for the wedding gift. The entry read, she was the only family member to do so, and she seemed genuinely moved that I'd attended the ceremony. Patricia, meanwhile, hasn't spoken to me since the reception, when she introduced me to Richard's family as our eccentric aunt, who travels too much. I've been watching this family for 78 years, and I'm beginning to understand who has real character and who just pretends. I flipped through the pages, reading entry after entry about family gatherings I'd attended, phone calls I'd made, birthday cards I'd sent. Minerva had been documenting everything, paying attention to details I'd never realized anyone noticed. She'd recorded Patricia's complaints about my clothes, Richard's dismissive comments about my job, the way their daughters were encouraged to see me as the poor relation, who should be grateful for whatever attention she received. But she'd also recorded the moments when I'd shown up for family members in crisis, when I'd offered help without being asked, when I'd put the family's needs before my own even when it cost me financially. She'd seen everything, understood everything, and made her choice based on years of careful observation. The manila folder contained financial reports that explained why Patricia and Richard's situation was even more precarious than I'd realized. Minerva had hired a private investigator to look into their finances, not out of malice, but out of concern. The reports painted a picture of a couple living far beyond their means, accumulating debt they couldn't service, making increasingly desperate financial decisions to maintain their lifestyle. Richard's real estate company was technically bankrupt, kept afloat only by creative accounting and borrowed money. They'd already taken out a second mortgage on their house and were behind on payment. Patricia's car lease was in default and they owed significant money to several credit card companies. Eleanor's family knew about their problems, but had refused to help, viewing Richard's financial mismanagement as a character flaw that disqualified him from further support. The photographs were the most revealing of all. They showed Patricia and Richard at social events I'd never been invited to, charity galas and country club functions where they posed with Eleanor's family and other wealthy socialites. In every picture they looked tense, uncomfortable, like actors playing roles they hadn't quite mastered. The strain of keeping up appearances was visible in their forced smiles and Patricia's too bright laughter, but the final photograph was different. It was taken at a family barbecue 3 years ago, one of the last gatherings where I'd felt truly welcome. In the picture I was helping Patricia's daughters with an art project, all 3 of us laughing at something Madison had drawn. Patricia was in the background watching us with an expression I'd never noticed at the time, a mixture of sadness and longing, like she wished she could join us but didn't know how. I stared at that photograph for a long time, remembering the woman Patricia used to be before she married Richard and decided she needed to become someone else. She'd been fun once, spontaneous and creative and unafraid to be silly. She'd been the sister who stayed up all night with me when our grandmother was dying, the one who helped me practice job interviews when I was trying to get promoted, the one who cried with relief when I finally graduated from college. But that woman had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who cared more about Eleanor's approval than her own sister's feelings, someone who would rather exclude family than risk social embarrassment, someone who had forgotten that the best parts of herself were the parts that couldn't be bought or performed. I closed the folder and leaned back in the bank chair, processing everything I'd learned. Minerva hadn't just left me her estate. She'd left me the tools to understand my family's dynamics with perfect clarity. She'd given me information that would allow me to make informed decisions about when and how to use my new resource. And she'd given me something else, something I was just beginning to recognize. She'd given me permission to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. She'd shown me that I had value independent of anyone else's recognition, that I didn't need to earn love and respect. I deserved them simply by being who I was. When I left the bank, I felt like I was walking taller. The afternoon sun seemed brighter, the spring air cleaner. I had important work to do, and for the first time in my life I had the resources to do it properly. My first stop was Carmen's real estate office. She was waiting for me with a thick folder of information about properties in Westfield Heights, her dark eyes bright with curiosity about my sudden interest in expensive real estate. I have to ask, she said as I settled into the chair across from her desk. When we talked yesterday, you were living in a 1-bedroom apartment and working as a medical secretary. Today you're asking about investment properties in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. Did you win the lottery or something? Something like that. I inherited some money from a great aunt. Quite a bit of money actually. Carmen's eyebrows rose, but she was too professional to pry further. She opened the folder and began laying out property listings and market analysis report. Based on your request, I focused on properties that might become available due to financial distress. The market's been tough on people who overextended themselves during the boom years. She showed me 3 properties that caught my attention immediately. The first was a colonial mansion 2 streets over from Patricia's house, owned by a couple who'd defaulted on their mortgage and were facing foreclosure. The second was a commercial property in downtown Westfield Heights that housed several upscale boutiques, currently owned by a small investment group that was rumored to be having cash flow problems. But it was the third property that made my pulse quicken. It was Patricia's house. Now, this one isn't officially on the market yet, Carmen said, lowering her voice, but I have reliable information that the owners are in serious financial trouble. They've missed 3 mortgage payments, and the bank is starting foreclosure proceedings. The couple might be motivated to sell quickly to avoid the damage to their credit rating. I studied the listing photos of Patricia's perfect house, the one where there hadn't been room for me at the Easter table. According to Carmen's research, Patricia and Richard owed more on the mortgage than the house was currently worth. They were underwater financially and drowning in debt they couldn't service. What would it take to purchase this property before it goes to foreclosure auction? I asked. Carmen pulled out her calculator. Well, you'd need to pay off the existing mortgage plus any accumulated penalties and fees. Then you'd need to negotiate with the owners for whatever equity they might have, though in this case that appears to be minimal. All told, you'd probably be looking at around $800,000. $800,000? 6 months ago, that amount would have seemed impossible, a sum so large I couldn't even comprehend it. Now it represented less than a quarter of my liquid assets, money I could spend without significantly impacting my overall financial position. I want to make an offer, I said. Carmen's eyes widened. Are you sure? This is a major purchase. Maybe you should take some time to think about it. Get a financial advisor involved. I've already thought about it, I said, and I have excellent legal and financial advice. I want to make an offer today contingent on a quick closing. Cash purchase. No financing contingency. Carmen stared at me for a moment, then shook her head with a smile. Okay then, let me make some calls and see what I can arrange. But whatever happened to you, whatever changed between yesterday and today, good for you. You deserve nice things. While Carmen worked her phone, making discreet inquiries about Patricia's situation, I walked to the window of her office and looked out at the busy street. People were going about their normal Monday afternoon routines, unaware that my world had completely transformed in the space of 24 hours. Yesterday, I'd been the family outcast, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion were thrown my way. Today I was a woman with options, with power, with the ability to shape my own destiny. Carmen hung up her phone and turned to me with an expression of barely contained excitement. You're not going to believe that. I just spoke with their listing agent. Apparently they're so desperate to avoid foreclosure that they're willing to consider any reasonable offer. The bank has already started the legal process, and they need to close within 30 days or lose everything. What did you tell them? I told them I had a cash buyer who could close in 2 weeks. They want to set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. Everything was falling into place with an almost supernatural precision, like the universe was finally aligning in my favor after years of working against me. Set it up, I said. But Carmen, I want you to handle all the negotiation. Don't mention my name until after we have a signed purchase agreement. This needs to stay confidential until the closing. Carmen grinned. I love a good mystery. Don't worry, I'll handle everything discreetly. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by legal documents and real estate contracts, planning my next moves with the methodical precision of a chess master. I'd spent my entire adult life reacting to other people's decisions, accommodating their needs, accepting their judgment of my worth, but now I was the one making the moves, setting the terms, deciding how the game would be played. My phone rang around 8 o'clock. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's consideration, I decided to answer. Thank God, she said, her voice tight with stress. I've been trying to reach you all day. What did you mean by that message you left yesterday? What new house? What decision? I let the silence stretch for a few seconds before responding. Hello, Patricia. How was the rest of your Easter celebration? Did Eleanor's family enjoy themselves? Don't be like that, Patricia said, her tone shifting from relief to irritation. You know, yesterday was complicated. There were circumstances you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I understand that there wasn't room for me at your table. I understand that my presence would have been embarrassing for Eleanor's family. I understand exactly where I stand in your priority. Patricia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, less certain. You're my sister. Of course you matter to me. Yesterday was it was a difficult situation. Yes, it was, I agree. And it taught me some valuable lessons about family loyalty and respect. Lessons I'll be applying going forward. What does that mean? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. It means I'm finally learning to value myself the way I deserve to be valued. It means I'm making some changes in my life that will ensure I never have to beg for a place at anyone's table again. You're scaring me. Are you okay? Do you need help with something? The irony of that question was almost too perfect. Patricia asking if I needed help, when she was the one facing foreclosure on her house and bankruptcy for her husband's business. Patricia offering assistance when she couldn't even afford to make her mortgage payment. Patricia worried about my welfare when her own financial situation was so desperate that she'd soon be forced to sell everything she owned, just to avoid complete ruin. I'm better than okay, I said. I'm exactly where I need to be, but thank you for asking. That's more consideration than you showed me yesterday. Please, can we just talk? Can you come over tomorrow night for dinner? Just the family, no one else. We can sort this out. I thought about Patricia's house, the one I would probably own within 2 weeks. I thought about sitting at her dining room table as the new owner instead of the excluded sister. I thought about the conversation we would have once she learned the truth about my changed circumstances. I don't think so, I said. I'm very busy with some new project, important decisions about my future. But don't worry, Patricia. When the time is right, we'll definitely have that conversation. I hung up before she could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new opportunities to position myself strategically for whatever came next. Tonight was for planning and preparation. I opened Minerva's journal and read a few more entries, learning more about the woman who had chosen to entrust me with her life's work. She'd been strategic too, patient and thoughtful in her approach to family relationships. She'd understood that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal caused temporary pain. Love without boundaries isn't love at all, she'd written in one entry. It's codependency masquerading as virtue. Real love requires us to hold people accountable for their choices and to protect ourselves from those who would take advantage of our generosity. I was beginning to understand what she meant. For years I'd enabled Patricia's treatment of me by accepting it without protest. I'd taught her that my feelings didn't matter by never insisting that they should. I'd allowed her to take my presence for granted by always showing up regardless of how she treated me. But that dynamic was about to change dramatically. Soon, Patricia would discover that actions have consequences, that relationships require mutual respect to survive, and that some mistakes can't be undone with simple apologies. I was no longer the sister who could be dismissed and ignored. I was no longer the poor relation who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention she received. I was a woman with resources, with options, with the power to determine the terms of every relationship in my life, and I intended to use that power very carefully, very strategically, and very effectively. Tomorrow Carmen would begin negotiating the purchase of Patricia's house. Within 2 weeks I would own the property where I'd been told there wasn't room for me. Within a month, Patricia and Richard would be forced to face the consequences of their financial irresponsibility and their social pretension. And when that moment came, when they realized they needed help and turned to the family they'd always taken for granted, they would discover that I had learned my own lessons about having room at the table. The difference was, when I decided there wasn't room for someone, I had the power to make that decision stick. The morning meeting with Patricia and Richard's listing agent took place in a sterile conference room at Carmen's office, where desperation hung in the air like cheap cologne. Their agent, a nervous young man named Bradley, who kept checking his phone every few minutes, spread out documents across the polished table with the enthusiasm of someone handling contaminated material. "My clients are very motivated to sell," Bradley said, not quite meeting Carmen's eye. "They're facing some time constraints that make a quick closing essential." Carmen maintained her professional composure, but I could see the gleam of satisfaction in her expression. She'd been in real estate long enough to recognize a distressed sale when she saw one, and this was textbook desperation. "My client is prepared to make a cash offer with a 2-week closing period," she said smoothly, "but given the accelerated timeline, we'll need some consideration on the price." Bradley's relief was almost palpable. "What kind of offer are we talking about?" $750,000, Carmen said without hesitation. "Cash, no financing contingencies, closing costs paid by the buyer, and we can close as early as next Friday if all paperwork is in order. I watched Bradley's face as he processed the offer. It was $50,000 less than the asking price, but given Patricia and Richard's circumstances, it was probably more than they'd hoped to get. The house was worth more in a normal market, but foreclosure sales rarely generated full market value, and everyone in the room knew it. "I'll need to present this to my clients immediately," Bradley said, already reaching for his phone. "When would your client be available for a property inspection?" "This afternoon," Carmen replied. "We'll want a full structural inspection and appraisal, but assuming everything checks out, we can move to contract signing by Wednesday." After Bradley left to contact Patricia and Richard, Carmen turned to me with an expression of pure amazement. "I have to ask again, are you absolutely sure about this? Buying your sister's house while she's in financial distress is going to create some serious family drama." I thought about Sunday afternoon, standing in Patricia's foyer while she explained that there wasn't room for me at her table. I thought about 15 years of being treated like an afterthought, of having my worth measured by standards I could never meet. I thought about Eleanor's dismissive glances and Richard's practiced indifference. "The drama already exists," I said quietly. "I'm just changing who has the power to control it." Carmen nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But what happens when they find out you're the buyer?" "Because they will find out. Probably sooner than you think. They'll find out when I'm ready for them to find out," I said. "Not before." That afternoon I stood in Patricia's driveway for the second time in 3 days, but everything felt different now. The cherry blossoms were still falling, creating the same pink carpet I'd walked across on Easter Sunday, but I wasn't the same woman who had carried a ham to a door that would be closed in her face. I was the potential owner of this property, the person with the power to determine who would be welcome here and who wouldn't. Carmen had arranged for the property inspection to be conducted by a team from Springfield's most reputable inspection company. While they measured and tested and documented every aspect of the house's condition, I walked through the rooms with new eyes, not as Patricia's sister begging for acceptance, but as an investor evaluating an acquisition. The house was beautiful, I had to admit. Patricia had excellent taste when it came to decorating, and Richard's construction background meant the renovations had been done properly. The kitchen where I'd been excluded on Sunday was magazine-worthy, with granite countertops and professional appliances that gleamed under the afternoon sunlight. The dining room, where there hadn't been space for me, could indeed seat 30 people comfortably, just as I'd thought. But I could also see the signs of financial stress that Patricia and Richard had tried to hide. Paint touched up hastily to cover nail holes where artwork had been removed, probably sold to generate cash. Furniture arranged to disguise spaces where pieces had been taken away. Light fixtures that had clearly been replaced with less expensive alternatives. The house was still beautiful, but it was the beauty of a performance, carefully maintained to create an illusion of stability that no longer existed. The inspection took 3 hours. When it was finished, the lead inspector handed Carmen a preliminary report that confirmed what the asking price had suggested. The house was structurally sound and well maintained, worth every penny of the offer we'd made. There were no major issues that would delay the sale or require price negotiations. "Congratulations," Carmen said, as we walked back to our cars. "Assuming your financing is in order, you'll own this property by next Friday." "My financing is in order," I assured her. Margaret had already arranged for the funds to be transferred from my investment accounts, and the bank was prepared to issue a cashier's check for the full purchase amount. "Carmen, I want you to handle something else for me. I want you to research commercial properties in downtown Westfield Heights, specifically retail spaces that might be available for lease or purchase." Carmen raised an eyebrow. "Planning to open a business, something like that?" I said. "I'm thinking about making some investments that will give me a presence in the community. It's important to be visible in the right places." That evening I moved the first load of my belongings into Minerva's house. It wasn't much. I'd been living in a furnished apartment for years, and most of my possessions fit easily into the back of my car, but carrying my clothes and books and personal items into that beautiful Victorian mansion felt like crossing a threshold into a different life entirely. The house welcomed me with the scent of fresh flowers and lemon oil, evidence that the cleaning service Margaret had arranged was maintaining everything perfectly. I chose Minerva's former bedroom as my own, drawn to the eastern exposure that would fill the room with morning light. As I hung my modest wardrobe in the walk-in closet that had held Minerva's extensive collection of designer clothing, I felt like an actress stepping into a role I was still learning to play, but the role was beginning to When I looked at myself in Minerva's antique mirror, I didn't see the anxious woman who had driven to Patricia's house on Easter Sunday. I saw someone who belonged in beautiful spaces, someone who had earned the right to live surrounded by art and elegance and comfort. My phone buzzed with a text message from Bradley, Patricia's listing agent. Offer accepted. Clients are grateful for quick closing timeline. Can we schedule contract signing for Wednesday morning? I forwarded the message to Carmen with a note of my own. Perfect. Make sure all documents are ready for my signature. Tuesday brought news that accelerated my timeline considerably. Carmen called me early in the morning with information from her network of real estate contacts, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. You're not going to believe what I just heard, she said. Richard's construction company filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Word is getting around that they're going to lose everything. The business, their equipment, probably their house if they haven't sold it already. How long before this becomes public knowledge? I asked. In a small community like Westfield Heights, maybe 48 hours before everyone knows. The bankruptcy filing will be in the public records, and Richard's competitors will make sure the information spreads quickly. I thought about Patricia's pride, her carefully constructed image, as the successful sister who had married well and achieved social status. The news of Richard's business failure would destroy that image overnight, would confirm what Eleanor's family had probably suspected all along, that Patricia and Richard were pretenders who had overextended themselves trying to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. Carmen, I want to accelerate our closing timeline, I said. Can we close tomorrow instead of Friday? Tomorrow? That's incredibly fast, even for a cash sale. The title company will need to work overtime to get everything processed. Money is no object, I interrupt. Pay whatever expedite fees are necessary. I want to own that house before the news about Richard's bankruptcy becomes common knowledge. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Okay, I can probably make it happen, but I have to ask why the rush. What difference does it make if we close tomorrow or Friday? I thought about Patricia's phone calls, the increasing desperation in her voice as she tried to reach me. I thought about the conversation we would inevitably have once she learned that I was the person who had bought her house, the person who now controlled the property where she'd told me there wasn't room, because timing is everything. And I want to control when and how certain information becomes available. By Tuesday afternoon, the expedited closing was arranged. The title company had worked with remarkable efficiency, motivated by the substantial fees I'd authorized Carmen to pay for their emergency service. All documents were prepared, all funds were verified, and all parties were scheduled to meet at the law office at 10 o'clock Wednesday morning. I spent Tuesday evening in Minerva's library, reading her journals and learning more about the art of strategic patience. She'd understood that power used carefully was far more effective than power wielded recklessly. She'd known when to reveal information and when to keep secrets, when to act and when to wait for the perfect moment. The key to maintaining control, she'd written in one entry, is never letting others know how much control you actually have until you're ready to use it. People respond differently when they realize they're dealing with someone who has real resources and real options. Make sure you're prepared for that change before you reveal your hand. I was beginning to understand what she meant. Once Patricia learned that I'd bought her house, everything between us would change forever. She would realize that I wasn't the poor relation she could dismiss and ignore. She would understand that I had resources that could help her family or destroy them, depending on how she chose to treat me going forward. But that revelation needed to happen at the right moment, in the right context, with the right preparation. I needed to be ready for her response, ready for the conversation that would determine whether our relationship had any future at all. Wednesday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather, as if spring had decided to celebrate my transformation with sunshine and gentle breezes. I dressed carefully for the closing, choosing a navy blue suit that Minerva had left in the closet, designer quality but understated elegance. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who belonged in boardrooms and law offices, someone who could negotiate from a position of strength. Carmen met me in the lobby of the title company's building, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal curiosity. "Ready to become a homeowner?" she asked as we rode the elevator to the third floor. "I've been ready for this my entire life," I just didn't know it until now. The closing took place in a conference room with windows overlooking downtown Westfield Heights. Patricia and Richard were already seated when Carmen and I arrived, both of them looking like they'd aged years in the past few days. Patricia's usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wasn't wearing the expensive jewelry she typically displayed at social events. Richard had dark circles under his eyes and kept checking his phone with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. They looked up when Carmen and I entered, and I saw the exact moment when Patricia recognized me. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally something approaching panic. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Carmen answered before I could speak. "Miss Johnson is my client," she said smoothly, taking her seat across from Patricia and Richard. "She's the cash buyer we discussed." The silence that followed was profound. Patricia stared at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head, while Richard's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of sick understanding. The listing agent, Bradley, looked between all of us with the expression of someone who had walked into a family drama without warning. "I don't understand," Patricia said slowly. "You can't afford to buy our house. You work as a medical secretary. You live in a one-bedroom apartment. You don't have $750,000. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Actually, I do," I said calmly. "I have considerably more than that. As it turns out." Richard leaned forward, his voice tight with suspicion. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "From our great-aunt Minerva," I said, watching their faces as the information sank in. "She passed away 6 months ago and left me her entire estate. I inherited nearly $4 million along with several properties and an extensive art collection." Patricia's face had gone completely white. $4 million? She repeated. "Minerva left you $4 million? "She did," I confirmed. "Apparently she'd been watching our family for years, paying attention to how people treated each other. She decided I was the only one who had earned her trust and respect." The title company representative, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should proceed with the closing documents," she suggested. "We can address any family discussions after the legal paperwork is completed." For the next hour we signed papers and transferred ownership of the house where I'd been told there wasn't room for me. Patricia sat in stunned silence while Richard signed with mechanical precision, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles working. When the final document was notarized and the keys were handed over, I was officially the owner of the property where I'd been excluded just 4 days earlier. "The closing is complete," the title company representative announced. "Congratulations on your new home, Miss Johnson." Patricia finally found her voice. "We need to talk," she said, her tone mixing desperation with something that might have been anger. "This is insane. You can't just buy our house. We're family." I stood up slowly, tucking the keys into my purse with deliberate care. "You're right, Patricia. We do need to talk, but not here and not now. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to have that conversation." "When you're ready," Richard said, speaking for the first time since the closing began. "What's that supposed to mean?" I looked at him steadily, this man who had stood beside Patricia when she told me there wasn't room at their table. "It means exactly what it sounds like, Richard. I'll decide when and where we discuss this situation. I'll determine the terms of any future relationship we might have. Just like you determined that there wasn't room for me in your home." Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't be serious. You bought our house out of spite, because of what happened on Easter." "I bought your house because it was a good investment," I said calmly. "The fact that it was your house is just an interesting coincidence." "This is revenge," Richard said, his voice rising. "This is sick, vindictive behavior." I smiled at him, the same practiced smile he'd given me on Easter Sunday when he told me Patricia wanted to speak with me. "No, Richard, This is consequences. This is what happens when you treat people like they don't matter and then discover that they actually do. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face them. Oh, and Patricia, don't worry about finding a new place to live immediately. I'm prepared to offer you a rental arrangement. We can discuss terms when I'm ready to have that conversation. I left them sitting in that conference room, staring after me with expressions of shock and disbelief. Carmen followed me out, and we rode the elevator down in silence until we reached the lobby. She said finally, that was either the most brilliant power play I've ever witnessed, or the most expensive family therapy session in history. Maybe both, I said, but it was definitely necessary. That afternoon I walked through my new property with a sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere ownership. This wasn't just about buying Patricia's house, it was about reclaiming my own power, about refusing to accept treatment that diminished my worth and dignity. I stood in the dining room where there hadn't been room for me on Easter Sunday, looking at the table that could easily seat 30 people. Soon I would host my own gatherings here. I would decide who was welcome and who wasn't. I would create the kind of family environment I'd always wanted, based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social status and financial calculation. My phone had been buzzing with calls and text messages from Patricia all afternoon, but I wasn't ready to respond yet. She needed time to process what had happened, to understand that the dynamics of our relationship had changed fundamentally and permanently. She needed to realize that I was no longer the desperate sister who would accept whatever scraps of attention she was willing to offer. But while Patricia processed her new reality, I had other work to do. I called Carmen and asked her to schedule viewings of the commercial properties she'd researched. I wanted to establish a business presence in Westfield Heights, something that would make it clear that I wasn't just visiting their community, I was becoming a permanent part of it. What kind of business are you thinking about, Carmen asked. An art gallery, I said, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. Minerva left me an incredible collection and much of it deserves to be displayed publicly. I think Westfield Heights could use a space that brings culture and sophistication to the downtown area. That's a fantastic idea, Carmen said enthusiastically. There's a beautiful space on Main Street that just became available. It used to be a boutique that couldn't make the rent, but it has excellent visibility and parking. Perfect, I said. Set up a viewing for tomorrow morning. That evening I sat in Minerva's library, my library, reading her journals and planning my next moves with the methodical precision of a chess master. The house purchase had been my opening gambit, establishing my financial credentials and demonstrating that I had resources Patricia had never suspected, but it was only the beginning of a longer strategy. I wanted more than just revenge. I wanted transformation. I wanted to create something positive and lasting from the pain of Easter Sunday's exclusion. I wanted to build a life so fulfilling and meaningful that Patricia's rejection would be revealed as the gift it had actually been. The catalyst that freed me from accepting less than I deserved. The art gallery would be my next move, a way to establish myself as a cultural force in the community where Patricia had always struggled to gain acceptance. Eleanor's family valued refinement and sophistication above all else. When they discovered that the poor relation they'd excluded from Easter dinner was now the owner of the town's premier art gallery, hosting events they would desperately want to attend, the social dynamics would shift dramatically. But first, I needed to have that conversation with Patricia. She needed to understand the new rules of our relationship, the boundaries I was setting, and the conditions under which reconciliation might be possible. She needed to hear directly from me that exclusion worked both ways, and that earning her way back into my life would require genuine change, not just desperate apologies motivated by financial need. I picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. We need to talk about what happened today. This whole situation is crazy. You're right, I said calmly. We do need to talk, but we're going to do it on my terms. At my house, when I'm ready to have that conversation. Your house? Patricia's voice cracked slightly. You mean our house? The house where Richard and I have lived for 15 years. No, Patricia, I mean my house. The house I bought today with my money. The house where I will decide who is welcome and who isn't, just like you decided on Easter Sunday. The silence stretched between us for several seconds before Patricia spoke again, her voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. What do you want from us, Doc? I thought about that question for a moment, considering all the possible answers. What did I want? An apology? An acknowledgement of how badly they'd treated me? A promise that things would be different in the future? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, I said finally. I want you to realize that the way you've treated me over the years isn't acceptable, and it's not going to continue. I want you to decide whether you're capable of being the sister I deserve, or whether you're going to remain the person who thinks there isn't room for me at her table. Of course there's room for you, Patricia said quickly. Sunday was a mistake. I was under pressure from Eleanor's family, and I made a bad decision. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough anymore, I said. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally bump into someone at the grocery store. What you did on Sunday was deliberate. It was planned. It was cruel, and it was the culmination of years of treating me like I didn't matter. Patricia was crying now, soft sobs that carried through the phone line. Please, I know I've made mistakes, but we're family. We can work this out. Maybe we can, I said. But it's going to take more than apologies and promises. It's going to take genuine change, and I'm not sure you're capable of that kind of transformation. Tell me what you want me to do, she pleaded. Tell me how to fix this. I looked around Minerva's beautiful library, at the books and artwork and evidence of a life lived with dignity and purpose. I thought about the woman who had chosen to trust me with her legacy, who had seen potential in me that I'd never recognized in myself. I want you to think about who you've become, Patricia. I want you to ask yourself whether the person you are now is someone you're proud to be. I want you to decide whether Eleanor's approval is more important to you than your own integrity. And when you've figured that out, when you're ready to have an honest conversation about what kind of relationship we might have going forward, then we'll talk. When? She asked. When will you be ready for that conversation? I'll let you know, I said, and hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet library for a long time after that call, processing the strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with finally standing up for myself. This wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when I drove to Patricia's house on Easter Sunday, but it was the ending that was necessary, the one that would allow me to build something better from the ruins of our damaged relationship. Tomorrow I would look at commercial properties and begin planning the art gallery that would establish my presence in Westfield Heights. Next week I would host my first social event in my new home, carefully choosing guests who valued substance over appearances. Next month I would launch a foundation using part of Minerva's legacy to support causes that mattered to me, creating the kind of positive impact that would make her proud of her choice. And Patricia would have to decide whether she was capable of becoming the kind of person who deserved a place in the life I was building, whether she could shed the shallow, status-obsessed persona she'd adopted and rediscover the sister I'd once loved and respected. I hoped she could, but I no longer needed her to, and that, I realized, was the most important change of all. The morning after our confrontational phone call, I woke up to find Patricia's car parked at the end of my driveway. She was sitting behind the wheel staring at Minerva's Victorian mansion with an expression I couldn't quite read from my bedroom window. She'd been there for who knows how long, working up the courage to approach or perhaps just trying to understand how her world had shifted so dramatically overnight. I took my time getting dressed, choosing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and well-tailored slacks that spoke of quiet wealth rather than flashy display. When I finally walked out to collect the morning newspaper, Patricia emerged from her car like someone approaching a crime scene she wasn't sure she was allowed to investigate. She said, her voice carrying across the pristine lawn that separated us. I've been waiting to talk to you. I bent to pick up the Springfield Herald, noting with some satisfaction that the business section's headline read, Local Development Company files Chapter 11. Richard's financial collapse was now public knowledge, which meant Patricia's carefully constructed social standing was about to crumble along with their bank account. I can see that, I replied, not moving closer. But I told you yesterday that I would determine when we had that conversation. Patricia took a tentative step forward, then stopped when she realized I wasn't inviting her any nearer. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by circumstances, and the growing understanding that she no longer held any cards in whatever game we were playing. I couldn't sleep, she said. I kept thinking about everything that's happened, everything I've done wrong. Richard's been pacing the hotel room all night, making phone calls to lawyers and accountants, trying to figure out how we're going to survive this. Hotel room? I asked, genuinely curious, despite myself. Patricia's face flushed with embarrassment. We can't afford to stay in the house while we look for something smaller. The mortgage payments alone would bankrupt us completely in 2 months. Richard's pride won't let him ask his family for help. And mine. She gestured vaguely toward the magnificent house behind me. Well, mine just bought the house we've been calling home for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on either of. Patricia and Richard were essentially homeless, while I was living in a mansion that made their former residence look modest by comparison. They were scrambling to find affordable housing while I was debating which of my 3 properties to use as my primary residence. Where are Madison and Morgan? I asked, referring to her twin daughters. Staying with friends from college. They don't know about the bankruptcy yet. Don't know we've lost the house. I haven't figured out how to tell them that their trust funds are gone, that they'll need to find jobs instead of spending the summer in Europe like we'd planned. I felt a flicker of sympathy for my nieces, who were innocent victims of their parents' financial mismanagement and social pretensions, but I kept my expression neutral, waiting to see what Patricia was really after. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, she continued, her voice beginning to crack. I know I treated you terribly on Easter, treated you badly for years, but we're desperate. Richard's talking about bankruptcy, about losing everything. The girls' college tuition is due next month and we don't have it. She was crying now, not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the raw, ugly sobs of genuine desperation. This wasn't the polished woman who had married into Eleanor's family and spent 15 years trying to belong in their rarefied social circle. This was someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, leaving her with nothing but the truth of her situation. What exactly are you asking me, Patricia? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek in a way that would have horrified her a week ago. I'm asking for help. I'm asking you to loan us money to get back on our feet. I'm asking you to remember that we're family, that we shared a childhood, that there was a time when we loved each other. I stood there in my driveway, holding the newspaper that announced her husband's business failure, looking at my sister who had become a stranger over the year. The woman who had excluded me from Easter dinner was now begging for financial assistance from the same person she'd deemed unworthy of a place at her table. You want me to help you, I said slowly. The sister you told there wasn't room for at your Easter celebration. The relative you've been embarrassed by for years. The poor relation you've apologized for to Eleanor's family more times than you can count. Patricia's shoulders sagged. I know how this looks. I know what you must think of me. But please. The girls don't deserve to suffer because of our mistakes. That was her strongest argument, and she knew it. Madison and Morgan were innocent in all of this, victims of their parents' choices rather than architects of their own downfall. But using them as leverage also revealed something important about Patricia's character. Even in desperation, she was still trying to manipulate rather than simply being honest about her own failures. The girls, I repeat, the same girls who haven't spoken to me in 2 years, because you've taught them to see me as the embarrassing aunt who doesn't fit with your new lifestyle. Patricia winced. That's not. I never told them not to speak to you. You didn't have to tell them direct. Children pick up on social cues, Patricia. They learn what their parents value by watching how they treat other people. You taught them that I wasn't worth their time or attention. I can change that, Patricia said quickly. We can change that. We can go back to being a real family, can we? I asked, because from where I'm standing, It looks like you're only interested in being family now that you need something from me. Where was this concern for family relationships when you had money and status? Where was this desire for closeness when I was struggling to pay my rent and could have used some emotional support? Patricia had no answer for that, and her silence spoke volumes. She'd never once offered to help me during my difficult periods, never suggested that family should support each other through hard times. Her definition of family had always been conditional, based on what people could do for her rather than any genuine bonds of affection or loyalty. I need to think about this, I said finally. I need to consider what kind of help, if any, would actually benefit everyone involved. Hope flickered in Patricia's eyes. Does that mean you'll help us? It means I'll consider what help might look like, I clarified. But Patricia, if I decide to offer assistance, it won't be a simple loan or gift. It will come with conditions, with expectations, with clear boundaries about how our relationship will work going forward. And you might not like what those conditions are. I'll agree to anything, she said desperately. We'll do whatever you think is fair. I shook my head. Don't make promises you haven't thought through. Go back to your hotel room. Talk to Richard about what you're really asking for here. Decide whether you're prepared to accept that the balance of power in this family has shifted permanently, and then we'll schedule a proper meeting to discuss terms. Patricia looked like she wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have warned her that pushing further would be counterproductive. She nodded reluctantly and walked back to her car, shoulders bent under the weight of circumstances she'd never imagined facing. After she drove away, I went inside and called Carmen. The commercial property viewing was scheduled for that afternoon, and I wanted to accelerate my plans for establishing a presence in Westfield Heights. The art gallery would serve multiple purposes. It would give me a legitimate business reason to be part of the community's social and cultural life. It would provide a venue for hosting events that would attract the kind of people I actually wanted to associate with, and it would demonstrate to Eleanor's family that I was someone worthy of respect and inclusion. Carmen, I want to move quickly on the Main Street property, I said when she answered. If the space works for what I have in mind, I want to sign a lease agreement today. That's very fast for a commercial lease. Don't you want to have a business plan drawn up? Maybe consult with an accountant about the financial projections. I have more than enough resources to make this work regardless of the financial projections, and I have a very clear vision of what I want to create. Sometimes speed is more important than extensive planning. The property on Main Street exceeded my expectations. It was a beautifully restored space with hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, and large windows that would showcase artwork perfectly. The previous tenant had been an upscale boutique that couldn't afford the rent, which meant the space already had the kind of sophisticated atmosphere I wanted for the gallery. The rent is $3,500 a month, the property manager explained as we walked through the space. That includes utilities and basic maintenance, but you'd be responsible for any modifications or improvements you want to make. $3,500 a month was more than I'd paid for my apartment for an entire year, but it represented less than 1% of my monthly investment income. The financial aspect was insignificant compared to the strategic value of having this location. I'll take it, I said without hesitation. Can we sign the lease agreement this afternoon? The property manager looked surprised. Don't you want to negotiate the terms? Most commercial tenants ask for modifications to the standard lease. The terms are acceptable as written, I said. I'd like to sign today and take possession immediately. I have some time-sensitive plans for this space. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was the proud lessee of 1,200 square feet of prime commercial real estate in downtown Westfield Heights. By 5 o'clock, I'd hired a local contractor to begin installing professional lighting and security systems suitable for displaying valuable artwork. By 6 o'clock, I'd placed orders for custom display cases and promotional materials, announcing the upcoming opening of the Minerva Johnson Gallery. Everything was happening faster than I'd originally planned, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the knowledge that news of my inheritance and property purchases would spread quickly through the community, and I wanted to control the narrative by presenting myself as a serious cultural contributor rather than just another wealthy newcomer. Or perhaps it was the realization that Patricia's desperation created an opportunity to reshape not just our relationship, but the entire dynamic of our extended family. Eleanor's crowd respected money, but they worshipped culture and sophistication. When they discovered that the woman they'd excluded from Easter dinner was now the owner of the town's most prestigious art gallery, their attitude would shift dramatically. That evening, I spread Minerva's art collection inventories across the dining room table in my new home, planning which pieces would be featured in the gallery's opening exhibition. She'd collected systematically over 40 years of travel, focusing on contemporary artists who were gaining recognition but hadn't yet achieved mainstream success. Many of the pieces had appreciated significantly in value, making the collection worth far more than the original purchase prices indicated. But it wasn't the monetary value that interested me most. It was the stories behind the pieces, the evidence of Minerva's relationships with artists from around the world, the proof that she'd used her wealth to support creativity and innovation rather than just accumulating status symbols. I selected 20 pieces for the opening exhibition, a carefully curated show that would demonstrate both the quality of the collection and my own taste and knowledge. The opening reception would be by invitation only, a sophisticated affair that would attract the attention of everyone who mattered in Westfield Heights' cultural and social circles. My phone rang while I was making notes about the exhibition layout. Richard's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation I decided to answer. He said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Patricia told me about your conversation this morning. I wanted to call and talk to you directly. I'm listening, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened on Easter Sunday. The decision to exclude you was mine, not Patricia's. She was caught between Eleanor's expectations and her loyalty to you, and I pushed her to choose Eleanor. This was interesting. Richard had never shown any indication that he cared about my feelings or Patricia's family relationship. His sudden acceptance of responsibility seemed calculated rather than genuine, like a negotiating tactic designed to improve their chances of receiving financial assistance. Go on, I said. I also want you to know that I understand the situation where I know we have no right to ask for your help after the way we've treated you, but we're drowning here. The bankruptcy will destroy any chance I have of rebuilding my business. We'll lose everything, including our ability to support the girls through college. And you think that's my problem to solve? Richard was quiet for a moment before responding. No, I think it's our problem to solve, but I'm hoping you might be willing to help us find a solution that works for everyone. What kind of solution did you have in mind? I don't know, he admitted. I'm out of ideas, out of options. Patricia thinks you might be willing to loan us enough money to settle the debts and start over. But honestly, I don't know how we'd ever pay you back. My business skills obviously aren't what I thought they were. His honesty was unexpected and more compelling than Patricia's emotional appeals. Richard had always been arrogant about his business acumen, confident in his ability to navigate complex deals and profitable investment. Admitting failure and incompetence couldn't have been easy for someone with his ego. Richard, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Do you actually want me to be part of this family, or do you just want access to my money? The question hung in the air for several seconds before he answered. 6 months ago I would have said the money, but 6 months ago I thought I was smarter than I actually am. I thought status and wealth made me a better person than people who had to work for a living, and now I realize that the person I've been for the past 15 years isn't someone I'm proud of. Patricia and I got so caught up in trying to impress Eleanor's family that we forgot what actually matters. We forgot that you're someone worth knowing and respecting regardless of your bank account. It was a pretty speech and parts of it might even have been sincere, but I'd heard enough manipulative conversations over the years to recognize when someone was telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Richard, I appreciate your honesty, but I need more than words. If I decide to help your family, it won't be because you've convinced me you've changed. It will be because I believe change is possible and I want to create conditions that encourage it. What would those conditions look like? I thought about Minerva's journals, about her understanding that real transformation required both consequences and opportunities. Simply bailing Patricia and Richard out of their financial problems wouldn't teach them anything or create lasting change, but providing help that came with clear expectations and accountability might accomplish both goals. I'm not ready to discuss specific conditions yet, I said, but I will tell you this. Any assistance I provide will be earned, not given. It will come with expectations about how you treat other people, how you prioritize relationships over appearances, how you demonstrate respect for family members regardless of their social status. We can do that, Richard said quickly. Don't make promises you haven't thought through, I warned, echoing what I'd told Patricia earlier. Think carefully about what you're agreeing to, because if I decide to help and you fail to meet the conditions, there won't be a second chance. After ending the call with Richard, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Minerva's library, surrounded by evidence of a life lived with purpose and dignity. The books on these shelves represented decades of learning and growth. The artwork on the walls spoke of relationships with creative people around the world. The letters in her desk drawers revealed a woman who had used her resources to make a positive difference in countless lives. I wanted to build something similar, but I also wanted to use this unexpected inheritance to heal the fractures in my own family, if healing was possible. Patricia and Richard would need to demonstrate genuine change rather than just desperate compliance, but perhaps the crisis they were facing would create an opportunity for authentic transformation. The next morning brought news that accelerated my timeline once again. Carmen called early to inform me that word of my property purchases and art gallery plans was spreading through Westfield Heights faster than she'd anticipated. You're the talk of the town, she said, barely containing her excitement. Eleanor Whitmore called my office this morning asking about your background and your plans for the gallery. Apparently she's heard that you have some museum-quality pieces in your collection. Eleanor calling about me was significant. She was the unofficial cultural arbiter of Westfield Heights, the woman whose approval could make or break social and business ventures in the community. The fact that she was showing interest in my gallery meant that my strategy was working. I was being seen as someone worth knowing rather than someone to be dismissed. What did you tell her? I told her she should speak with you directly about the gallery, but that I understood you were planning a very sophisticated opening exhibition. I might have mentioned that you'd studied art history in college, and had spent years researching contemporary artists. It was a slight exaggeration. I'd taken a few art history courses and had always been interested in museums and galleries, but it wasn't completely false, and in the context of establishing my credibility with Eleanor's crowd, it was exactly the right information to share. Carmen, I want you to do something for me. I want you to research event planning services in the area. I'm going to host the gallery opening reception, and I want it to be the kind of event that gets people's attention. How elaborate are we talking? Elaborate enough to establish my reputation as someone who knows how to do things properly. Elaborate enough to make Eleanor Whitmore want an invitation. By noon, I'd hired Springfield's most prestigious event planning company to organize a reception that would showcase both the artwork and my own sophistication. The event would be held in 3 weeks, giving the contractor time to finish the gallery modifications and the event planners time to create something memorable. But first, I needed to address the situation with Patricia and Richard. Their crisis couldn't wait 3 weeks for resolution, and I'd decided that their situation might actually enhance my gallery opening if handled strategically. I called Patricia and asked her to meet me at the gallery space that afternoon. When she arrived, I was standing in the empty room with the contractor, discussing placement of track lighting and security cameras. "It's beautiful," Patricia said, looking around the space with genuine appreciation. "You're really opening an art gallery." "I am," I confirmed. "The opening reception will be in 3 weeks. By invitation only, featuring pieces from Minerva's collection, along with works by several contemporary artists she'd been supporting." Patricia walked slowly around the room, taking in the possibilities. "Sees. This is incredible. You're going to be the cultural center of the community. Eleanor's going to be so impressed when she sees this." "Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss with you," I said. "I've been thinking about your situation, about what kind of help might actually be useful, rather than just temporarily delaying the inevitable." Hope flickered in Patricia's eyes. "What did you have in mind?" "I have a proposal," I said. "Not a loan, not a gift, but an opportunity to earn your way back to financial stability, while rebuilding our relationship at the same time." "I'm listening." I gestured around the gallery space. "I need someone to manage this business, someone with good organizational skills, someone who understands the social dynamics of this community, someone who can handle the administrative aspects, while I focus on the curatorial side. Patricia's eyes widened. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a position as gallery manager, with a salary that would cover your basic living expenses and allow you to start rebuilding your financial foundation. The position would also come with a small apartment above the gallery, which would solve your immediate housing problem. She stared at me for a moment, processing the implications. I don't know anything about running an art gallery. But you know about event planning, about managing social situations, about presenting things in the best possible light. Those are exactly the skills I need. The art knowledge can be learned. What would you expect from me? I'd been thinking about this since my conversation with Richard the night before, considering what conditions would create real accountability while offering genuine opportunity for redemption. Complete honesty about your finances and your mistakes. A commitment to treating me and everyone else who works here with respect and dignity. Active participation in rebuilding our family relationships based on mutual support rather than social status. And most importantly, a willingness to acknowledge publicly that you were wrong about excluding me from Easter dinner. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer and its implications. You want me to apologize publicly? I want you to demonstrate that you've learned something from this experience, that you understand why your behavior was wrong and are committed to being better, going forward. And if I agree to all of this, then you'll have stable employment, decent housing, and the opportunity to rebuild your life with dignity. More importantly, you'll have the chance to be the sister I always hoped you could be. Patricia looked around the gallery space again, then back at me. What about Richard? What about the girls? Richard will need to find his own path forward. I'm not offering to solve all of his problems, just to provide you with an opportunity to solve yours. As for Madison and Morgan, if they want to rebuild relationships with me, they're welcome to try, but they'll need to earn that, just like everyone else. This is a lot to process, Patricia said slowly. Take your time, I said. But not too much time. I need to fill this position before the opening reception, and there are other qualified candidates I could consider. It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't interviewed anyone else for the position, but Patricia needed to understand that my offer came with limitations and expectations. She couldn't take my generosity for granted or assume that her family connection entitled her to special treatment. Can I think about it overnight? Of course. But Patricia, understand that this isn't just about employment. This is about whether you're capable of becoming someone I can respect and trust. If you take this position and then revert to your old patterns of behavior, there won't be another chance. After Patricia left, I spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing plans for the gallery opening. The event planners had suggested a cocktail reception with catered hors d'oeuvres and live piano music. Sophisticated, but not ostentatious. The guest list would include local business leaders, cultural figures, and selected members of the social circle that had excluded me from Easter dinner. Eleanor Whitmore would receive an invitation, along with her family and their associates. They would discover that the woman they deemed unworthy of Easter dinner was now someone whose social events they desperately wanted to attend. The irony was almost too perfect to be accidental. That evening, I reviewed Minerva's journals one more time, looking for guidance about balancing justice with mercy, consequences with compassion. She'd faced similar decisions about family members who had disappointed her, and her approach had always been to offer opportunity rather than simply punishment or reward. The goal isn't to destroy people who have made mistakes, she'd written in one entry. The goal is to create conditions that encourage growth and prevent future mistakes. Sometimes that requires being firm about boundaries, but it should always include the possibility of redemption for those who demonstrate genuine change. I was offering Patricia the possibility of redemption, but on terms that protected my own interests and established clear expectations about future behavior. Whether she was capable of meeting those expectations remained to be seen, but at least the opportunity would be there. My phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and I knew she'd made her decision. She said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. I want to accept your offer. I want the job, and I want the chance to be a better sister than I've been. Are you sure? I asked, because once you commit to this, there's no going back to the old dynamic. We'll be equals in this business relationship, but I'll be the owner, and you'll be the employee. Can you handle that power structure? I can handle it, she said. And thank you. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving, even after everything I've done. Don't thank me yet, I said. Thank me when you've proven that my faith in you was justified. After hanging up, I sat in Minerva's beautiful library, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and a legacy thoughtfully planned. In 3 weeks, I would host the opening reception for the gallery that would establish my place in this community's cultural life. Patricia would be there as my employee and partner, demonstrating to everyone who had witnessed her exclusion of me that family dynamics could change when people were willing to do the hard work of growth and accountability. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I drove to Easter dinner carrying my grandmother's ham and hoping for acceptance, but it was a better ending, one that I'd created through my own choices and actions rather than waiting for others to decide my worth. The woman who had been told there wasn't room for her at the family table was now the person who would determine who deserved invitations to the most exclusive cultural events in town. And that transformation, I realized, was exactly what Minerva had envisioned when she chose to trust me with her legacy. 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of transformation that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The Minerva Johnson Gallery emerged from an empty storefront into something truly spectacular, with professional lighting that made each piece of artwork glow like a jewel, and security systems that rivaled those of major museums. Patricia threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised me, arriving early each morning and staying late into the evening to ensure every detail was perfect. Watching her learn the business was like witnessing someone rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under years of social pretension. She had a natural eye for arranging displays and an intuitive understanding of how to make visitors feel welcome without being overwhelming. More importantly, she approached each task with humility, asking questions instead of pretending to know things she didn't, and accepting guidance without the defensive pride that had characterized so much of our previous interaction. The apartment above the gallery had been transformed as well, from dusty storage space into a comfortable living area that Patricia could call home without embarrassment. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was clean and tasteful and represented genuine independence rather than charity. She'd moved in quietly without fanfare or complaints about the reduction in her living standards. Richard, meanwhile, had found work with a construction company owned by one of his former competitors, accepting a position as a project manager rather than an owner. It was humbling work for someone who had run his own business for 20 years, but he approached it with the same determination Patricia was showing at the gallery. The bankruptcy proceedings were moving forward, but he was earning enough to contribute to the girls' college expenses and rebuild his credit rating gradually. Madison and Morgan had returned from their semester abroad to discover their world completely changed. The trust funds were gone, the European summer trip was canceled, and their parents were living in reduced circumstances that required careful budgeting and realistic expectations about the future. But instead of the rebellious anger I'd expected, they seemed almost relieved to be free from the pressure of maintaining appearances they'd never been comfortable with anyway. The girls had both reached out to me separately, awkward phone calls that began with apologies and evolved into genuine conversations about family dynamics and personal values. They were young adults trying to figure out who they wanted to be independent of their parents' expectations, and they seemed genuinely interested in getting to know their aunt as a person rather than just a distant relative they'd been taught to tolerate. The opening reception for the gallery was scheduled for a Friday evening in early May, when the spring weather would be perfect for the kind of elegant outdoor component I'd planned. The guest list had grown to include nearly everyone who mattered in Westfield Heights cultural and social circles, along with several art critics from Springfield and even a few collectors from larger cities who had heard about Minerva's collection. Eleanor Whitmore had not only accepted her invitation but had called personally to express her excitement about the gallery and her admiration for what I was creating. The woman who had influenced Patricia to exclude me from Easter dinner was now treating me like a valued addition to the community, someone whose cultural contributions she genuinely respected and wanted to support. The transformation in Eleanor's attitude was emblematic of how quickly social dynamics could shift when circumstances changed. Money alone hadn't earned her respect, but the intelligent use of resources to create something beautiful and meaningful had convinced her that I belonged in their circle. She'd even volunteered to write a piece about the gallery for the local society magazine, describing it as exactly the kind of sophisticated cultural venue the community had been missing. On the morning of the opening reception, I stood in the gallery surrounded by Patricia and the event planning team, making final adjustments to lighting and display arrangement. The space looked magnificent, with 20 carefully selected pieces from Minerva's collection arranged to create natural conversation areas where guests could examine the artwork while socializing comfortably. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a stunning contemporary sculpture that Minerva had commissioned from an artist in Florence, a piece that represented the intersection of classical techniques with modern sensibility. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated artwork that would impress Eleanor's crowd while demonstrating my own knowledge and taste. It's absolutely perfect, Patricia said, stepping back to admire the overall effect. Minerva would be so proud of what you've created here. It was the first time Patricia had mentioned Minerva without a hint of jealousy or resentment about the inheritance, and I recognized it as another sign of how much she'd grown over the past few weeks. She'd stopped seeing my good fortune as something that had been taken away from her and started understanding it as an opportunity for all of us to become better versions of ourselves. She would have loved seeing you work so hard to make this succeed, I replied. She always believed that people could change if they were given the right opportunities and incentives. The catering staff arrived at noon to begin setting up the refreshment station, bringing equipment for an open bar and trays of sophisticated hors d'oeuvres that would complement the artistic atmosphere without overwhelming it. The pianist who would provide background music arrived shortly after to test the acoustics and practice the selection of classical pieces I'd requested. By 4 o'clock everything was ready except for the guest of honor. I went upstairs to Patricia's apartment to change into the outfit I'd selected for the evening, a navy blue cocktail dress that Minerva had left in her closet, paired with jewelry from her collection that spoke of quiet elegance rather than flashy display. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who belonged in the life I was creating, someone who had earned the respect and admiration I was about to receive. The woman who had been told there wasn't room for her at the Easter table had become someone whose own events would be the most sought-after invitations in town. Patricia knocked on the door just as I was putting on the finishing touches. She'd changed into a simple black dress that she'd borrowed from one of her daughters, appropriate for her role as gallery manager without competing with my position as owner and hostess. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying my reflection in the mirror. "I've been ready for this my entire life," I said. "I just didn't know it until recently." The first guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, early arrivals who wanted to examine the artwork before the crowd made intimate viewing more difficult. I recognized several faces from Patricia's Easter gathering, people who had been present when I was excluded but who now greeted me with warm smiles and genuine interest in my cultural project. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at 6:30. Resplendent in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, accompanied by her son Marcus and his wife Victoria. She moved through the gallery with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, but her focus was clearly on the artwork rather than on asserting social dominance. "Dorothy, this is absolutely magnificent," she said, pausing in front of a painting by a contemporary artist whose work was just beginning to gain international recognition. "Where did you acquire such an extraordinary collection?" "My great-aunt Minerva spent 40 years building this collection," I explained. She had remarkable instincts for identifying talented artists before they achieved widespread recognition. "Many of these pieces have appreciated considerably since she purchased them." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "She clearly had exceptional taste and intelligence, and you've displayed them beautifully. This gallery is exactly what our community has been lacking." As more guests arrived, I found myself moving easily through conversations about art and culture, drawing on knowledge I'd accumulated over years of museum visits and gallery browsing that I'd never imagined would become professionally relevant. Patricia circulated as well, handling practical questions about the gallery's hours and upcoming exhibitions, while I focused on the more substantive discussions about artistic merit and cultural significance. Richard arrived around 7 o'clock, dressed in a suit that had seen better days but was clean and pressed, accompanied by Madison and Morgan, who looked genuinely excited to see their aunt's accomplishment. He approached me with an expression of nervous determination, clearly preparing to deliver a speech he'd been rehearsing. I wanted to publicly apologize for my behavior on Easter Sunday, he said, his voice carrying far enough for nearby guests to hear. I made a terrible decision based on shallow priorities, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. You deserved better from all of us, and I'm grateful that you've given us the opportunity to make amends. The conversations around us quieted as people registered what was happening, but instead of awkward tension, there was a sense of witnessing something meaningful and authentic. Richard's apology was clearly genuine, delivered without self-pity or attempts at justification, and the guests who heard it seemed moved by his honesty and humility. "Thank you, Richard," I said simply. "I appreciate your honesty, and I'm glad we've been able to move forward positively." The evening continued with a steady stream of compliments about the artwork, the gallery space, and my vision for creating a cultural center that would benefit the entire community. Several people mentioned that they were already looking forward to future exhibitions, and a few asked about the possibility of the gallery featuring work by local artists as alongside Minerva's collection. But the most satisfying moment came when Eleanor approached me near the end of the evening, after most of the other guests had departed and the catering staff was beginning to clean up. "Dorothy, I owe you an apology as well," she said, her voice quieter and more personal than her earlier public comments. "I was wrong to influence Patricia's decision about Easter dinner. I made assumptions about you based on superficial factors, and I failed to recognize your true character and capabilities." "Thank you, Eleanor. That means a great deal to me. I hope you'll consider joining the board of the Westfield Heights Cultural Foundation," she continued. "We need someone with your knowledge and passion to help guide our community's artistic development." It was an invitation that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier, when I was the excluded sister grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance might be thrown my way. Now it was being offered as recognition of my legitimate qualifications and contributions, a position I'd earned through my own efforts rather than family connections or social manipulation. "I'd be honored to serve on the board," I said. After the last guests departed and the cleanup was complete, Patricia and I sat in the gallery surrounded by the artwork that had made the evening such a success. She looked tired but genuinely happy, more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the job, not just for helping us through the financial crisis, but for giving me the chance to remember who I used to be before I got so lost in trying to impress people who didn't really matter." "You did the hard work," I reminded her. "I just provided the opportunity." "I know you could have chosen revenge instead of redemption," Patricia continued. "You could have let us lose everything and felt justified in doing it. The fact that you chose to help us rebuild says more about your character than mine. Maybe, but it also says something about yours that you were willing to accept help that came with conditions and expectations. Not everyone would have been humble enough to do that." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, processing the success of the evening and the transformation it represented for both of us. The gallery would continue to operate and grow, featuring rotating exhibitions that would establish Westfield Heights as a destination for serious art lovers. Patricia would continue to manage the day-to-day operations, while I focused on curatorial decisions and community outreach. But more importantly, we'd rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than family obligation or financial dependency. Patricia had proven that she was capable of genuine change when circumstances required it, and I'd discovered that forgiveness was more satisfying than revenge when it was earned rather than simply granted. The following Monday brought a phone call from Margaret Preston with news that put the perfect finishing touch on my transformation. A major museum in New York had contacted her about purchasing several pieces from Minerva's collection for a retrospective exhibition on contemporary art collecting. The sale would generate enough income to establish the charitable foundation I'd been planning, with enough left over to expand the gallery and perhaps acquire additional properties for cultural development. Minerva would be thrilled. Margaret's. She always hoped her collection would eventually benefit a broader community rather than just being preserved in private. I thought about that as I walked through downtown Westfield Heights later that morning, noting how differently people responded to me now that I'd established myself as a significant contributor to the community's cultural life. Shop owners greeted me by name, other business leaders stopped to chat about the gallery and express interest in future events, and several people mentioned that they'd heard about my appointment to the Cultural Foundation board. The woman who had been told there wasn't room for her at the Easter table had become someone whose approval and participation was actively sought by the same people who had once dismissed her. But more importantly, I'd become someone I genuinely respected and admired, someone who used resources wisely and treated relationships with the dignity they deserved. Patricia was already at work when I arrived at the gallery, updating the visitor log and preparing for a group of art students who were scheduled to tour the exhibition that afternoon. She looked up when I entered, her face bright with the kind of genuine happiness that couldn't be faked or performed. "The review in this morning's Springfield Herald is incredible," she said, holding up the newspaper. "They're calling it the most sophisticated cultural addition to the region in decades." I skimmed the review, written by the art critic who had attended the opening reception. It praised not only the quality of the artwork but also the thoughtful curation and the elegant presentation that made the gallery accessible to both serious collectors and casual admirers. But the final paragraph was what made me smile. It noted that the gallery was operated as a partnership between the owner and her sister, describing it as an example of how family businesses could thrive when based on mutual respect and shared vision rather than mere blood relations. The critic had unknowingly captured the essence of what I'd been trying to create, not just a successful business or cultural institution, but a demonstration that relationships could be rebuilt and strengthened when people were willing to do the difficult work of acknowledging mistakes and committing to better behavior. That afternoon, as I watched Patricia expertly guide the art students through the exhibition, explaining the historical context and artistic techniques, with knowledge she'd acquired through dedicated study, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing potential fulfilled. She'd become exactly the kind of gallery manager I'd hoped she could be, professional and knowledgeable but also warm and engaging. The students asked thoughtful questions about the artists and their work, clearly inspired by both the artwork and Patricia's passionate presentation. Several mentioned that they planned to return with friends and family members, exactly the kind of community engagement that would ensure the gallery's long-term success. As evening approached and I prepared to close the gallery for the day, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Easter Sunday when I'd been told there wasn't room for me at the family table. The exclusion that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the catalyst for discovering my own worth and creating the life I'd always deserved. I owned beautiful properties that provided both comfort and investment income. I operated a successful business that contributed meaningfully to my community's cultural life. I served on boards and committees that shaped local policy and development. I'd rebuilt relationships with family members based on mutual respect rather than obligation or need. Most importantly, I'd learned that acceptance and belonging weren't things to be begged for or earned through diminishing myself to fit other people's expectations. They were things I could create for myself by living with integrity and using my resources to build the kind of community I wanted to be part of. The woman who had driven away from Patricia's house carrying an unwanted ham and a wounded heart had become someone who hosted the most anticipated cultural events in town, someone whose opinion was sought and valued, someone who had transformed rejection into the foundation for a rich, more meaningful life. As I locked the gallery door and walked to my car, I noticed Patricia watching from her apartment window above. She waved and smiled, a gesture that spoke of gratitude and affection rather than the desperate need that had characterized our interactions just weeks earlier. We'd both become better versions of ourselves through this process, proving that sometimes the most painful experiences can become the most valuable gifts if we're willing to use them as opportunities for growth rather than excuses for bitterness. The cherry blossoms were blooming again, as I drove through Westfield Heights toward my Victorian mansion, the same pink petals that had fallen like confetti on that Easter Sunday when everything changed. But now they seemed like a celebration rather than a mockery, nature's way of acknowledging that renewal and transformation were always possible for those brave enough to embrace them. I pulled into my circular driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the beautiful house that had become my sanctuary and symbol of the life I'd built through my own choices and effort. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use Minerva's legacy wisely, new chances to support artists and cultural development, new possibilities for expanding the positive impact I could have on my community. But tonight was for quiet satisfaction, for appreciating how far I'd traveled from that moment when I was told there wasn't room for me at someone else's table to this moment when I had created my own table where everyone was welcome, as long as they brought genuine respect and authentic friendship. The woman who had learned there was no room for her had discovered that she had all the room she needed to build exactly the life she wanted. And that discovery, I realized, was worth more than any inheritance, more valuable than any property, more precious than any social acceptance I could have begged for or bought. I was finally home, in every sense of the word. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.